Welcome to the Fear and Greed Saturday edition, a look at some of the most memorable stories of the week. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Morning, Michael.
So our Saturday show is all about the two of us, each nominating what we think is the biggest story of the week, the most remarkable story, the sleeper story, and then our favourite story. And then we'll see if we can agree on any winners. So let's jump into it. What did you think was the biggest story of the week?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to agree with me on this one, but inflation in the United States. Stay with me, Michael. Stay with me.
You're losing me. You're losing me.
Last month, inflation in the US was 6.2% higher than a year earlier. Core inflation was up 4%. So what? Why does it matter? Well, I tell you why. Inflation is a global phenomenon. Commodity and energy prices are set globally. That's why we pay extra for petrol at the moment. Trade flows between countries are far greater now than any other time in history. So what happens in one country is exported to others. If US inflation is more permanent than thought, and the US Federal Reserve will have to lift interest rates, that will trickle through to Australia. That's both the higher prices and potentially the higher interest rates. Higher US rates will immediately depress the Aussie dollar. We know that actually happened this week. But inflation will be imported into Australia. In fact, it's already happening. There was a run of companies this week, Michael, talking about higher input prices or transport costs or logistics problems or all three. In fact, Orica talked about it, Breville did, scrap metal maker Sims did, Kathmandu did. These price pressures out of the US will put more pressure on the Reserve Bank to rethink what it's doing on interest rates. The pressure is amping up on the central bank to tighten monetary policy. Now, the critical indicator for the Reserve Bank is jobs. Last month, the unemployment rate jumped to 5.2% from 4.6%. That doesn't sound very good. But if you look through all the noise, the labour market is actually pretty strong. Governor Phil Lowe is talking next week on inflation. It'll be very interesting. There wasn't a lot of attention paid to the US inflation numbers this week, but long term, that is easily the biggest story of the week. Michael, what's yours?
Well, Sean, if there was a category for the story in which I learnt the most, then that would be a clear winner. And it is a very big story, but I have a contender. On Monday, we talked about a $2.8 billion bid for Link Group that had come in the previous week. And at the time, we were lamenting the fact that there hadn't really been that many deals, and we were talking about the fact that there'd been a bit of a deal drought. Then, 7 deals and announcements in one day on Monday. They really kind of ranged in size from the very big. There was the $23.6 billion cash offer for Sydney Airport by a consortium of really mostly super funds, right through to the, well, I suppose, comparatively small $104 million for the Penfold Motor Group, $43 million for Kiwi Insurance. For me, it's the biggest story just because of how much money is out there at the moment. Investors, including the big super funds, are really looking for quality assets, and with interest rates so low, they can afford to go into debt, but they also need something that's going to give them a decent return. So I'm not bending the rules really, but I'm grouping all of the big deals and announcements this week into one story and claiming it as the single biggest story of the week.
It's a good call. Can I just add a little addendum to that? Of all the deals that happened this week, and you're right, there was a stack of them, and I'm going to concede that this is the biggest story of the week. The one that I thought was really interesting was the independent experts report on the Santos Oil Search deal. Oil Search, which is an oil company mostly operating in Papua New Guinea. What the report said is that Oil Search shareholders will end up with 38.5% of the company. Fine. But right now, they own 43 to 44% of the company. So it's a dud deal for Oil Search shareholders. However, so much money needs to be invested in these big oil and gas companies that Oil Search probably doesn't have the money to do it. So long term, they're better off doing the deal. Anyway, the upshot of all that is that the biggest story are all the big deals. My favourite at the moment is definitely the Santos Oil Search one, because what's a shareholder to do?
Absolutely. So we agree.
Yep. 1-0.
All the deals, 1-0. Okay, most remarkable story. Do you mind if I go first on this one?
No, go for it. I think we're going to agree.
This one was a pretty easy one, I reckon. Chalice Mining this week announced Australia's biggest ever nickel sulfide discovery, and it's the biggest one anywhere in the world for the last 20 years. Analysts described it as the best discovery of platinum group elements ever seen. So that means it includes, obviously, platinum, copper, palladium, cobalt, nickel, of course, and gold as well. All of that would be remarkable in itself, particularly because of the rising demand for battery metals like nickel. On its own, that would be enough to win Most Remarkable Story. And the Chalice share price, I suppose, has certainly shown it to be remarkable because it has just soared this week. But the best part of it is when you consider how big Western Australia is, this discovery was made on the outskirts of Perth, just 70 kilometres away, pretty much on the doorstep. And you know what it does? It restores a little bit of hope for all of us that you could, well, find gold in your own backyard.
Maybe just a little bit. I do agree that is definitely the most remarkable story of this week. Incredible how big that find was. A second place, though, I want to give it to all mining stocks, not just Chalice. So Fortescue Metals Group was up 8% on Thursday. Basically, they found a honeypot of about $800 million to spend on green initiatives, and everyone loves green resource stocks at the moment, and that sent FMG shares up more than 8%. Battery metal companies, they just keep doing really well. Pilbara Minerals, which mines lithium, is up about 400% over the past 12 months. Orocobre is up 200%. Others like Lynas Rare Earths and Iluka have done really well. The gold companies, they did really well this week, just as the price of gold went beyond $1,860 an ounce. Now, gold is a store of value. When inflation rises, and remember the story I was talking about the US importing inflation into Australia and globally. So when inflation hits, the price of gold rises and investors want gold companies. Even the iron ore players like BHP, Rio Tinto and Champion Iron did better towards the end of the week with iron ore futures rising. So I'm giving second place to mining stocks. And Michael, I'm going to give a third place, a bronze medal here.
Go
Just
on.
a special mention to Elon Musk, who last weekend ran a Twitter poll of whether he should sell 10% of his Tesla stock. That's worth about $20 billion. The majority said yes, so he sold about $5 billion through the week. Remarkable.
That is remarkable. Maybe a little bit crazy as well, but remarkable. So, all right. We are 2-0, I believe. I almost feel bad keeping score.
No. 1.5 to half, because I agreed with the first one.
I don't know if you can have half points, but I'm going to give it to you because I don't have much hope for you for the rest of it because I have some crackers coming up. But what's your sleeper story this week, Sean?
Well, the sleeper story is all about nuclear energy. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has backflipped on nuclear power plants. To achieve carbon neutrality, France will need to embrace nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, of course, has very low emissions. Japan's going to have to do exactly the same things, having shunned nuclear for about a decade, ever since the Fukushima disaster. Nuclear is back. Now, the price of uranium, which is a key ingredient in nuclear energy, isn't far off 9-year highs. They were hit back in September, and that's good news for some of the Australian uranium miners. Obviously, during nuclear fission, a neutron collides with the uranium atom and splits it, releasing energy. That's how we end up with nuclear energy. Nuclear power is back on the agenda thanks to COP26 and the push to carbon neutrality. We're going to hear plenty about it over the next few decades, but we're not talking about it much at the moment. That's why it's the sleeper story of the week.
Is there going to be a discussion in Australia, do you reckon?
Absolutely. I think that at some point, all potential power sources have to be discussed and nuclear will come into that debate.
Well, that's going to be a hard one to beat for sleeper story. I do have one, and it's a real sleeper story because it comes from an infrastructure summit. And infrastructure summit and sleeper just kind of go together for me.
How rude.
I know, and apologies to all infrastructure fans. But this was actually really quite interesting. Tritium is a company that manages electric vehicle charging stations across the world. And the CEO, Jane Hunter, was speaking at this infrastructure summit put on by the Australian Financial Review. And she said that electric vehicles will cost less than internal combustion cars in 3 to 4 years, which I think is just incredible. The research out of the US says that in about 2025 for light vans, 2026 for passenger vehicles and four-wheel drives, that's really where that tipping point's going to be. 5 years ago, the battery was 50% of the cost of the car. Now it's 30% and it's gradually getting cheaper. So that's really how the cost of the car is coming down. But what it does is makes you realize just how far we still need to go on EV infrastructure in Australia, with companies like Tritium really kind of getting behind that. It is a really big barrier to entry at the moment. And that's kind of part then of the government's EV policy that they announced this week, $250 million for charging and hydrogen refueling stations. The Prime Minister wants 1.7 million low and zero emission cars on the roads by 2030. I just think that the scale of what we're talking about here, but the fact that really we haven't paid a huge amount of attention to it in Australia, probably because of these infrastructure challenges up until now, make it a good sleeper story for the week. Maybe not as good as nuclear power, but not too bad.
Yeah, I saw a director of Tritium speaking a couple of weeks ago, and she was really interesting. She said, what will really make EVs take off is someone pulling up to the charging station, taking the same amount of time to charge the car as it now takes to fill it up with petrol and getting the same range. That's actually table stakes, and we have a long way to go. So it's interesting that the price of cars are coming down, but for people to actually adopt it, they actually need a better experience than what they're getting now with internal combustion engines.
Yeah.
Anyway, having said that, 1.5.
Yep, we are even. Finally, this will be the decider. Sean, what was your favourite story of the week?
Look, not everyone loves Paul Keating, former Prime Minister of Australia, but he was back at the National Press Club this week, interviewed by one-time adversary Laura Tingle, who's now with the ABC and a friend of Fear and Greed. PJ Keating is clearly a bully, let's be honest, with a very defined point of view. Whether he's talking about geopolitics or some architectural disaster in inner Sydney, he's always very colourful. Now, he hadn't been to the press club for a couple of decades, and he came out this week firing on all cylinders. He was wonderful. Forget whether you agree or disagree with what he said. It's how he said it that was just so much fun. He spoke of Australia being at odds with its geography in terms of the US-UK alliance, and as he put it, we are still trying to find security from Asia rather than in Asia. When talking about Australia's 8 subs that it's buying from the US and UK and how they'll handle a fight against China in 20 years' time, he said it would be like throwing a handful of toothpicks at a mountain. What a great analogy.
That's a ripper.
He's talking about how the US posits itself on discussions with China. He said it would make a cat laugh. Now, I have no idea what that means, Michael. I don't think I've ever seen a cat laugh.
No. It's a good line.
It is a great line. On China's diplomacy, I have to quote this one. They are in the rude phase. They are in the adolescent phase of their diplomacy. They have testosterone running everywhere, the Chinese, but we have to deal with them because their power will be so profound in this part of the world. Beautiful. On Australia's rediscovered love for the UK, interestingly here, he forgot Boris Johnson's name. You know, here's our old friend. What's his name? The British Prime Minister, waxing lyrical down there in Cornwall. I mean, Britain is like an old theme park sliding into the Atlantic compared to modern China. China is just going to be huge. Wow. If only we could get that back. That's my favourite story.
It's not bad, is it? And especially some of them would be prepared, but a lot of them you do feel like they are just off the cuff, and there is nobody quite like that in politics these days.
Exactly.
Well, for my favourite story of the week, I think I might have you on this one, Sean. It is very hard to go past Big Bird this week. He has always been probably Sesame Street's least controversial character, not anymore, because he tweeted this week, and yes, there's a bit of irony in that he got his COVID vax after the Pfizer shot was approved in the US for kids aged between 5 and 11. Now, I would have thought that's just good public health campaigning, but not everybody agreed. Texas Senator Ted Cruz declared it to be propaganda for 5-year-olds. One Fox News commentator said Big Bird was brainwashing children. Another host said it was evil. Another one said that Big Bird was a puppet. And I just don't know if they actually meant that ironically or not. But anyway, Big Bird has been encouraging vaccinations for decades. He had his measles vax in 1972. He was 6 years old then. He is 6 years old today, and it appears that he is still ruffling feathers.
Oh, very good. His vaccines means he never grows old, which is what we're all about, isn't it?
I don't know if that's what he's actually claiming is causing his immortality. But
I'm happy to give that to you. I think that definitely has to be the favourite story of the week. You win, Michael.
it is an absolute ripper. Look, I wasn't even keeping score, but it was 2.5 to 1.5 in the end. So that is a convincing victory. Just a quick reminder before we go, though, Sean, we've had some great interviews this week. Everything from professional investors and economists to Blackmore's CEO, Alastair Symington. That was a great chat about how to manage really quite disruptive shareholders. If you want to listen to any of those interviews or indeed any of the shows over the past week, all of them are available on your favourite podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au, where you can also sign up for our free daily newsletter. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael. Enjoy your Saturday.
Thank you. And don't forget that tomorrow we'll both be back with Adam Lang from the Fear and Greed team to have a bit of a lighter look at some of the news around the place. I'm Michael Thompson. Have a good Saturday and a great weekend.